Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. As brewers become more and more mindful of the impact we're having on the environment, it's important to look for new and innovative ways to reuse or upcycle brewing waste. And that's exactly what my guest Dean Hauser did on last week's episode of the Brew Lab. This week, we're changing things up a bit. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today I'm back in the lab with Jordan Folks as we start regularly applying the science to each Brew Lab episode. Jordan, welcome back to the lab.
Hey, it's good to be back. You know, this stuff is kind of complicated, and as a regular listener, you know, it's kind of hard to keep up sometimes. There's just it goes so deep, and so I'm excited to kind of walk it back a little bit with you, and kind of think more about how we would use this and what it all means, without kind of getting too into the weeds of p-values and sample sizes and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's exactly what we're going to do, right? So this is sort of a new format for us, and we're going to explore it and let us know what you think. So it's like on almost every episode, I ask for feedback about the show, and you know, because of course I want to know that we're providing content that you want to hear. And the most common critique of the show is that sometimes things get a bit too heady, right? And I hear you. And so some of the concepts that we discuss are complicated, like Jordan just mentioned, and they take some time to digest. So a while back, I don't remember, was it episode 60 or episode 70 that you started, Jordan? I don't remember. But anyway, Jordan and I started doing these applied science episodes every 10 episodes where we talk about what we learn and how we use it in our brewery, or the implications of the science, or any of those things. And I was talking with Jordan, and we were thinking about this and thinking about making it a more regular series. So like very regular, meaning like every other week kind of regular. So 1 week you hear from a scientist, and then 1 week you hear Jordan and I break down the science. So hopefully explaining it in a way that's more digestible and a little bit easier to understand and follow. Because we also get a really positive source of feedback, which is that people love the science too, right? I mean, I think if you're listening to this show or the Brewlosophy podcast or watching the Brewlosophy show or experiments, you're into the science, and that makes sense. And so that's one of the things that we want to stay true to in this show, is sharing science, but we also want people to be able to apply it, whether they're a home brewer or a commercial brewer or any of those things. It kind of occurred to me, and I was mentioning this to you before the show, Jordan, that some brewers hate the term balance. Right? They don't want to say like, oh, this is a balanced beer, because they hate the way that sounds. But it is kind of what we're going to start doing, balance. So on one episode, we'll have me interviewing the scientist. We'll go deep into the details. We'll learn about the science. And then the next week, literally the following week, you and I will come on and talk about it and break it down in a way that's digestible, right?
And I love the term balance, and I think a good beer must be balanced. Maybe that's why I love lagers so much, because you can actually drink the whole pint because it's so balanced. And so this definitely jives with my beer attitude, so I'm excited to dive into this a couple times a month with you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and again, I'll keep diving into the science with real brewing scientists, but then we'll apply it. So we're excited to check out this new format, and let us know what you think. Right? So this is the first episode, but we're going to start doing it every 2 weeks. If you like this format, shoot us an email and let us know. Or if there's other things that you think we could do to improve, also let us know. You can shoot an email to feedback@brewlosophy.com, or you can email me directly, Cade@brewlosophy.com. We'll get either one of those and improve the show. All right, don't forget to check out patreon.com/brewlosophy if you haven't already. For just a small monthly contribution, you get access to rewards like unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. And this week, but also this month's guest, you'll have to hurry to get access to, is Clay Disney, founder of Jaded Brewing. Jaded Cade makes a variety of wort chilling products like the King Cobra, the Hydra, and the Cyclone. And if you've watched the most recent Brewlosophy Show episode on YouTube, you'll see that there are a lot of ways to tweak your chilling process. Clay is the guy that you want to ask your chilling related questions of. So how fast should the water flow? How do you clean the chiller? How do immersion chillers compare to plate or counterflow chillers? What the heck are plate or counterflow chillers or immersion chillers? Ask Clay any of those things. He literally knows it all. But to do this, you've got to sign up this week. So sign up to become a patron and ask Clay any of these questions by visiting patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Another great way to support us is by clicking the links at brewlosophy.com/support. We've got a bunch of affiliate sponsors who give us a small kickback when you purchase from them using our links. It's literally one of the easiest way to support us. You just start your shopping experience by clicking those links at brewlosophy.com/support. All right, this week's feedback is brought to you by the folks from John I. Haas, who over the last couple of years have released a handful of really cool hop products like Lupamax, Incognito, and Flex, all intended to improve beer while reducing vegetal matter and thus increasing yields. Well, they're excited to announce their latest 100% hop-derived product, especially made for your patio, lawnmower, or beach beers. Kettle Ready imparts smooth, light, stable bitterness and kettle hop aroma to beer while offering microbiological protection during the brewing process. This new product is easy to use, has no special dosing requirements, plus, due to its standardized high alpha acid concentration in a light, stable molecule, it gives the light stability and bitterness characteristics desired for all traditional beers. And it plays well with other Haas products, including Tetra Hop Gold, Hexa Hop Gold, Ready Hop, for flexibility and optionality when brewing light, stable beers. Learn more about Kettle Ready at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. Listener Ben H. wrote in about episode 95, using Koji to malt barley with Tom Williams and Brett Taubman. And he says, good episode as always, fun and interesting, but your guests were acting like this was cutting edge, and they were the first to do it. But Mugi Koji, I think that's how you say it, Mugi, M-U-G-I, Koji, has been used in Japan for a long time. So to anyone interested in this topic, Google Mugi Koji. Mugi means wheat, grains, or barley. It's used to make sochu, miso, or other products, and you'll find some fun stuff. It's not common in beer, but a brewery near me uses it for their beers. They're a malt-free brewery, but they still use a lot of barley. And he has a link to the brewery, which is called Oryzae Brewing, O-R-Y-Z-A-E, brewing.com. So thoughts on this one, Jordan?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess I'm not that surprised. You know, these types of brewing traditions from Japan have been around for a lot longer than the American craft beer movement has. I don't have a whole lot of experience making sake. It would be kind of fun to give it a try sometime. And I think that makes a lot of sense, that if you're not using malted barley, you need something to kind of assist that process if you're using, I guess, raw barley. And so it sounds like this is a really cool kind of way to still make interesting beers that are malt-free.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you make a good point about these things being used for hundreds of years, right? And I thought Tom or Brett, or maybe both, brought that up, that there were certainly instances of people using Koji with barley for different applications. I don't think they specifically mentioned like miso or sochu, but I'm pretty sure they brought something of it up. But I think their point was more that there's not a lot of research out there on the topic of malting barley with Koji. And I know it certainly wasn't common for people Japanese brewers to use barley, to make beer or, that. It was definitely, like you said, like sochu, sake, those kind of beverages. And interestingly, Oryzae Brewing actually claims to be the first ever Japanese Koji beer, which I think is really cool. It's like you said, there's got to be some sort of, way. If you're using raw barley, you've got to unlock those starches. You got to use the enzymes, to convert those into the starches that the amylases can get to and break into fermentable sugars, which is what happens in Koji with sake production. But yeah, this was really cool, though. The info about Mugi Koji, it was really fun. It's pitched as a health food, which I think is cool. And I definitely went down a Google rabbit hole looking at this for a long time, all the things that Mugi Koji can be used for, which is really cool. So, Bryn, I appreciate the comment, and thanks for listening to this show. We're going to take a short break, give some love to sponsors, and then Jordan and I will be back applying the science, talking about reusing spent hops.
One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com.
At the end of fermentation, beer gets racked out of the fermenter and into another vessel for conditioning or straight into the package for service. There's usually a good-sized chunk of sludge at the bottom of the fermenter, which is a combination of a lot of things: dead yeast, live yeast, protein coagulate, trub, and sometimes spent hops. Most of the time, that sludge goes down the drain or at best gets sent to a farmer for animal feed. And Jordan, if I'm thinking about ways to upcycle brewing waste, that sludge certainly seems like something to consider, doesn't it?
I mean, yeah, there's so much that's sitting at the bottom of a fermenter, and it's interesting how it kind of depends on the type of beer you're brewing. You know, like IPA is going to have a lot more at the bottom thanks to those dry hops. And, you know, sometimes, you know, in the mash, I recently brewed 100% wheat beer. There was so much trub at the bottom of my mash tun. So, you know, different styles of beers are going to have more or less trub and debris. And so, you know, I just throw it into the green bin, the compost bin, right? Mm-hmm. But it's like, is there a better way?
Yeah. I mean, mine goes down the drain in my house, right? I mean, we don't, Corvallis, where I live, doesn't have a composting service, or at least not where my house is. I had a compost pile, but it drew rats. And so that's not happening anymore. I know there's better ways to compost. Please don't send in feedback about that. I know I can do it, but it's just not something I'm doing right now. But yeah, I mean, so for me, it goes down the drain. And the breweries I've heard of, especially commercial breweries, depending on where you are, if you're in a city like Portland, for example, you're not going to be able to run that down the drain. Or if you are, you're going to end up paying much higher utility bills because the waste treatment plant has to process all that stuff. And guess what? There's a whole bunch of live microbes that mess up waste treatment, right? So you're dumping a whole bunch of sludge down into the drain. And I think that's a pretty cool impetus of this research, right? So I think that's maybe that's where we should start, right? It's like the overall concept of this research. If we're going to break it down, maybe we should start there. So what do you think about like the idea of spent hops as a reusable material?
Yeah, listening to that last episode, and remind us, who was the speaker?
Of course, I should have mentioned that. Thanks for reminding me. So Dean Hauser was the speaker. He did this research while at Oregon State, but now he's a student, a PhD student at Cornell University.
Right. And so in that episode, you all were talking about how there has been a fair amount of conversation around spent grains, right? And I that's exactly where my mind goes in terms of reusing ingredients, I guess, beyond yeast, which obviously has multiple generations of opportunity there.
Yeah.
I've had spent grain cookies every year for Oktoberfest. I used to make spent grain pretzels, but I'd never really thought too hard about reusing hops. I've heard, through the grapevine that there is still potential there. This conversation definitely isn't brand new, but that's not something I've ever attempted myself.
Yeah, me either. I like I said, whenever I'm done, all that stuff just gets washed down the drain. I mean, I now dry hop in those like stainless steel mesh tubes because I got tired of clogging dip tubes in my kegs. But all that just gets like dumped down the drain for me. So it's just like totally getting wasted. But it's interesting, right? So you made a really cool comment, right? You've heard through the grapevine that there's stuff left in the hops. Well, Dean actually did a prior study, and we talked about it a little bit on the show, right? Where they actually looked at what is left in hops. Like that's sort of the first question that you have to answer, right? And that was one of the things that I thought was really cool. Is like before we even figure out how we're going to reuse the spent hops, we got to know what's even in there. Like, what is it? And they looked in and saw like, oh yeah, these actual spent hops have a lot of alpha acids, like 60%. of alpha acids. And, there's other aromatic compounds and things. And that was another really cool piece of information that I found. It's not really germane to what we're going to talk about in this episode. This is kind of more of an aside. But the aromatic compounds that were left, all of the things that are soluble, so all the things that can go into beer, most of them went into the beer, right? Like the fruity flavors, these oxygen, like geraniol and linalool and, terpeniols and all this, all these other oxygenated compounds, those are polar. And so they are soluble and go into the beer. And they found that it's all the non-polar stuff. So all this like myrcene and the terpenes that get left in the dry hops. And those are still flavors that people like myrcene's herbal and spicy. I mean, that's a popular noble hop flavor. And it's still there. So that was, again, not super germane to the topic that we're having here, but it's kind of cool to see okay, so there are some non-polar compounds that are getting stuck in there. And guess what? Alpha acids are non-polar. Right. And so I was like, oh, that kind of that clicked a button for me. It's like, oh, there are a lot of things left in there. It's really cool to talk about that.
Yeah, and it's kind of reminiscent of party guiling, except for hops, right?
Right.
There's still sugar left over in a beer, a mash, especially a really big one, like an imperial stout or a barley wine or something like that. And for centuries, people have been adding more water to a mash that already made a beer to make a second smaller beer.
Yeah.
And so it seems totally reasonable we should be looking at hops too.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's some challenges, I think, with looking at hops, which we'll probably talk about those in the next segment. When we're talking about okay, if we were actually trying to imply this in our brewery, how would we do it, right? We might go through that a little bit in the next episode. I mean, one of the big challenges, just since I mentioned it, I guess, is how do you get the hops out, right? And how do you make sure you're just pitching hops and not, sludge or trub or anything else in there? I mean, I don't know that boiled yeast would taste all that great if I put it back in the boil. But so the boil is one of those places where we might be able to reuse hops. And that was actually sort of the main focus of the study that I talked about with Dean. It was how to reuse and recapture those alpha acids that are still in the hop, pitching it back into the boil. But I guess I don't know. Did I ask Dean if there were other places where we could put the hops other than just going straight back into the boil? Do you remember, Jordan?
I'm not confident enough to comment on that, but I would say that it, maybe not the best idea to try to re-dry hop with them, especially if only the non-polar compounds are left.
Yeah, exactly. Only but
myrcene, it does make me wonder if there's some sort of non-brewing application, right? Like maybe perfumes or something could be made. I wonder if there's some other industrial process that you could extract what's left in there to make some sort of product, that this world could benefit from.
Oh, that's a really interesting idea, right? Maybe there's some hop candles or something that we could make if we could pull the hops back out and then, press the oil and stuff, because there is. I mean, myrcene's it's part of the oil, right? So that's something that can actually come out. Yeah, but repitching them as dry hops, that's an option. Putting them back in the boil to get alpha acids out of them. Those seem really obvious to me, and I love the food application too. It's or the perfumes or essential oil applications to be able to use this. There's lots of ideas for upcycling. I'm not sure that anybody actually has looked into those or how much interest there would be or market for it, but these are the kinds of conversations that are important to have, right? It's important to think about how we can use that waste.
Well, and he makes an interesting comment there about refrigeration storage for these, that if you're not going to immediately use them, you got to keep them cold. And then it's well, what's the carbon, implication of then refrigerating this process? And at a certain point, you're no longer breaking even. You're actually doing more harm than good.
Yeah.
And so that would obviously be a consideration here is, for example, if there was some sort of extract of myrcene extract that had some sort of use in this world, well, if there's so little left that the industrial process to extract that would be so great that maybe you'd be better off using a raw material to begin with. And so obviously there's no easy answers when it comes to upcycling. And it's the same with recycling, right? That the energy that goes into recycling a can needs to be less than it takes to make a new one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great comment. And that's something that we have to keep in mind as we go through this, and especially as we're applying this science, right, is think about like, what's the cost? And I think, you're right. He mentioned that about refrigeration. And I thought that was a really key point as well. What is the cost of doing this, right? It's cool that we can do it, but what's the cost? Does it make sense? Is it actually hurting the environment more than we are by just upcycling the material? All right, there were a couple of terms that we talked about in the show that I think we should spend some time unpacking here. Hopefully these first two terms are things that most people listening to the show are aware of, but I don't want to make any assumptions about that. So we're going to start talking about the difference between alpha acids and isoalpha acids. And so, I mean, I can tackle this one, Jordan, or you can if you want to. Up to you.
I think I know the answer, but I want to see if I do.
Okay. All right. Yeah, cool. How about I go first and then you can be like, yeah, that's exactly what I thought.
Right.
But so alpha acids are what are in hops. All right. And they're nonpolar. They're present in hops. And so this is a very, very common thing that is measured whenever you're looking at hop quality. It's printed on the package, right? Whenever you go and you buy hops, it says X% alpha acids, right? Like 5%, 10%, 13%, whatever alpha acids on there. Those alpha acids are actually, they are bitter, but they're not as bitter as isoalpha acids. And isoalpha acids happens through a process called isomerization. All right. So that just means the structure changes, right? Think of it as like bending a piece of paper in a different direction, right? The paper is still the same. You didn't change the paper. It's still paper. You've just folded it in a different way. And what that means is you can put it in different places, or in this case, it becomes more polar. Right? And so polar means it'll go into beer. And it turns out isoalpha acids are very bitter. So that's part of the whole point of the boil, is to change alpha acids to isoalpha acids through this process of isomerization. Applying heat causes the alpha acid to change its structure, like folding a piece of paper, and then become more soluble and more bitter, which balances the beer. Is that what you thought, Jordan?
Something like that.
Something like that.
Now, a couple follow-up questions for you, and it's so fun to get to do this with a Oregon State fermentation science student. So what about beta acids, and also how are there other ways to isomerize, like pressure or enzyme or
That's
pH, I don't know.
That's a fantastic question, and I don't know the answer. Maybe I can ask Tom about that and send it back as feedback. If I remember correctly, and this is totally just me pulling this out of my butt a little bit here, but if I remember correctly, beta acids don't go through an isomerization because of their structure. They don't go through that isomerization process. But my understanding is, yes, isomerization can happen in other ways, right? There are other things that will do it. I don't think enzymes work for it, but I do think there is like pressure or other things. I'm going to leave that right there before I get too far out over my skids, because that's a really great question and something that's really, really interesting about, alpha acids versus isoalpha acids. How about I do this? I promise I will get this answer and I'll read it and we'll do it as feedback on an upcoming episode. Does that sound good?
Sounds like a deal. So, now, isoalpha acids kind of vary in their utilization. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That's another great concept from from the episode with Dean.
So maybe you can take a second to walk us through at a high level what utilization means.
Yeah, so utilization is how well that conversion happens, right? From alpha acids to isoalpha acids. And it's not 100%, right? When you put 13% alpha acids in the boil, you don't get 13% isoalpha acids in the beer. In most cases, it's actually really low. It's somewhere around like 20 to 40% in most breweries. On a homebrew scale, you can get a little bit better utilization than most commercial brewers, but it's still going to be pretty low. You're not going to get more than like 40% of the alpha acids to actually isomerize. It's a function of heat, it's a function of time, it's a function of other reactions going on and happening, all this sort of stuff. But utilization, that's all it is. How well does alpha acid change to isoalpha acid? So how well do we go from something that's not soluble and not as bitter to something that is soluble and is bitter that will get into the beer? That's all it is. It's a really useful metric for commercial brewers and even for home brewers to some extent too, because then once you understand that utilization, you can understand like, okay, I can hit my target bitterness every time.
Yeah, I'm about to start brewing on a claw hammer system. Super stoked for that. And one thing that I'm both excited and nervous about is dialing in the system, understanding mash efficiency, boil off rate, volumes, etc. But something that's been in the back of my mind is my hop utilization factor. It does change from system to system at the homebrew level. And, when I first got my last system, I had some beers that came out too bitter. And so I just had to kind of like revise my assumptions just kind of in my mind, maybe just back off the IBUs a little bit in my calculator just to kind of overcompensate for the greater utilization I was getting. So you mentioned heat and time. Is that really all this is at the homebrew scale? Is that some systems are like, assuming the boil time is constant, let's say 60 minutes, is it just a function of how hot your new system gets?
Yeah, I think there's a vigor component to it as well, right? Like meaning, how well the molecules are hitting together, right? Or like the concentration, the way that the molecules are moving around through the solution itself will cause isomerization to happen or not to happen. But heat and time are the biggest influencers whenever I say that. So if we're talking about increasing or decreasing utilization, it's heat and time. The problem is you can't get higher than 212 Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius without applying pressure or doing something else in the boil, right? So, and actually, there may be, again, out over my skis a little bit here, there may be a inverse reaction, right? If you increase the heat, it might actually slow isomerization, because it just breaks the molecule or something. Instead of isomerizing and folding the paper, you just tear the paper or something, if that makes sense.
What about gravity? Doesn't the gravity of the wort also influence utilization?
Yeah, I would think so, because it's going to mess with pressure, right? And so pressure is going to be changing throughout the wort because of gravity. If you've got a giant, barrel that's got, or a giant 20-barrel kettle, that's a lot different than a 5-gallon or 20-liter kettle, right? There's just different gravity associated with that and different pressures inside of the liquid.
I meant original gravity. The amount of right, but not that you're wrong, but yeah, because doesn't when you change your assumptions in your homebrew or brewing software calculator, the same amount of hops, if you double the malt, it changes the predicted IBU associated with the same charge.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah, if you double the malt, it changes the predicted IBU. I wonder, it's got to be something along with the solution, or with the stuff that's in solution, right? If you've got higher sugar, that's either going to increase or decrease utilization, right? I don't know which one.
But because we can't isomerize in water, right?
Right. Yeah. So maybe there's some substrate piece of it too. It interacts with something else to make that isomerization happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Ultimately, I guess every other week is going to be us, pleading for scientists to please come and correct us on the following week's episode, because there's definitely research out here that can kind of answer some of these questions we have.
Yeah, there's definitely research out here. And of course, we'll get better at this too as we get along, as we get going along. Maybe we can, preemptively answer some of these questions too. It's fun though, but one of the things that we want to do is talk about the science and what it means to us. And these are the kinds of questions that are fun to discuss, right? Hopefully anybody that's out there listening is going hey, these guys don't know what the hell they're talking about. But also are going oh yeah, that's a really cool question. I wish I knew the answer to that. And if you have questions like that, send them to me, Cade@brewlosophy.com. I'm happy to reach out to a scientist, do an episode on it, and then we come back and apply the science on that. So that'll happen. Okay, so utilization is kind of the difficult concept, right? One of the things I think about when I think of utilization is why, what does it tell me and why should I care? And what Jordan was doing with his system is the application of utilization, right? He's not calling it utilization, but that's what he's doing. Whenever you've got your new system and you notice that the beer is a little bit more bitter in your new system, so you change your calculator, right, to lower the amount of hops or whatever that you add into the next batch, and that hits the bitterness you want, you've just done a utilization measurement, right? If everything else is the same, assuming the ingredients and the recipe and all that stuff were the same, and you got a different level of bitterness in each of those beers, that's a difference in utilization based on the equipment. And so that's what utilization does. It just helps that. That's the term for it, I guess, if you want to say it, which I think that's a really cool takeaway, and hopefully that connects a dot for some people as well.
So when it comes to spent hops, remind us, we learned from the episode that there are are fewer alpha acids left over. That makes sense. Some were used. But in terms of their utilization, is that linear, or is it more difficult to utilize spent hops?
Yeah, no, yeah. So this was a cool one, right? This was one of the takeaways from his study, is that the utilization using spent hops was roughly the same as the normal T90 pellets, which is really cool, right? That's a really big takeaway. The utilization is about the same. The difference is the starting material, right? So you've only got like 60% of the alpha acid concentration in your spent hops, and there's other things that he mentioned, like there's some water weight in there, and there's probably some yeast and some trub or something else in there. So when you're weighing out the spent hops to put into the batch, you can't just, take like, okay, 60% times the original alpha acid and then dump that amount into your calculator, right? The utilization's the same. If you're able to measure it, if you're able to say like, if you're able to actually take this measurement and say, all right, this has, X number of alpha acids at 30% utilization, I'll get this number of iso alpha acids out. You can do that. And a lot of commercial breweries have the ability to do that. That's beyond most home brewers and most small breweries, right? Because they just don't have the equipment to be able to do that. So that was a really cool takeaway from Dean's research. You can do that calculation, and you can assume that your utilization is roughly the same. I mean, I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And, one thing he talked about was straining the liquid out, and maybe, if anything, just to like reduce the volume of the product.
Yeah.
Would there be anything that we lose in there?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. That's a cool idea, right? And that's maybe a part for future or for research, right? Is like, is anything still stuck in the water that's coming out? Or like, are you pulling things out with the water? Because it's polar. I mean, things are going to come out with it. Are alpha acids going out with the water, or what's in that, and how much is there? Can you reuse that?
Thinking about standardizing it too, right? Because if you're doing this by hand, you're likely going to be variable in the amount of liquid that you extract each time. And so, perhaps alpha acids and dried hops aren't as exact as we like to think they are anyway. But it's, you could see how there's going to be a bit of fudging it involved, unless you have some sort of massive industrial, lab that's able to analyze these things before you reuse them. Now, did he talk about, or do you know of any commercial brewers that are using this as a standard practice? Like, I could see a big dog like AB InBev or something doing something like this.
Like, right, trying to like squeak out like, every little extra bit of efficiency. No, he didn't mention any breweries doing it, and I haven't actually heard of any breweries doing it. And I think that's likely because of some of the challenges associated with it. And so this is actually a great place for us to take a break, and then we'll come back talking about implications, how we might apply this science in the brewery, challenges, and also opportunities for improving this. So hang around and we'll be right back.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
It's pretty cool to see brewers investing into sustainability measures in their brewery. Whether home brewers or commercial brewers, brewer spent grains gets a lot of attention, as I mentioned, and as you brought up earlier, Jordan. But spent hops don't get as much. And why do you think that is?
maybe it's because grains are also a food product, right? Like malt syrup can be used in baking applications, etc. And spent hops are like toxic for dogs, right? And so we don't really think of them as a culinary product. So I think that is a big part of it, is that spent grains can be like a livestock food source. And hops, it's like, well, now what do we do with these things?
Yeah, what do we do with these? Run them down the drain and let the wastewater people do
Right.
it. That's an interesting point. I like that. My wife actually asked me a while back. She asked, are hops used in anything other than beer? And I was like, I don't know.
I have heard of, in Europe, some sort of like hop bine salad or something that there is someone that's like, I don't know if you grill them or how they're doing it, but I have heard of a culinary application of the hop bine.
Wow, interesting. I've never seen it, but that's a really interesting point, right? Brewer's grains and malt extract. I mean, malt balls, right, are like malt extract. Right. And this is a candy that most Americans are going to be really familiar with. And I thought that was really interesting. That's what she was listening to it. She was talking about. She was listening to the episode with Harmony Bettenhausen where we were talking about rye, and in that episode we talked about Pat Hayes, where it was saying that like if beer didn't exist, barley probably wouldn't exist anymore either. At least not like 2-row applications that we use for brewing. Like the stuff that can be used to turn into malt extract. And she was asking about that. She was like, well, yeah, I mean, are hops used in anything else? Like, would hops exist if beer didn't exist? I think it's a really interesting conversation.
Well, don't they also say that if beer didn't exist, society wouldn't exist?
Right? Yeah.
That the purposeful agriculture, etc., so much can be linked back to making our favorite beverage.
Exactly. All right. So back to the episode with Dean. Again, big takeaway here. He was using spent hops to add bitterness to the beer, and it worked, right? I mean, again, I think that's like the coolest piece of this is like, oh my gosh, yeah, you can actually reuse hops, achieve the same utilization, and so recover materials that are just left in a fermenter, and for the most part, again, just getting dumped down the drain. So I think that's a really, really cool application. A couple of other things, and this one seems so minor, but it's such a big deal. There were no differences in the fermentation metrics. There was no change to attenuation, no change to ABV or foam or pH or any of those other things. So I think that's a really cool, there may be other things in the hops when you're adding them into the kettle, but it didn't change any of the the fermentation metrics. And that seems like such a small thing, and you kind of go, well, why would it? Well, if you don't test it, how would you know?
Right.
I guess, right? But there may be like additional yeast or something, or like other batches of things that are, I mean, if you're boiling the yeast, they're not gonna survive. But who knows? I mean, maybe there's other compounds or things in there that cause issues with fermentation, or things that poison the yeast, or who knows? I mean, I'm just like totally spitballing here. There may not even be anything that could hurt it. But I thought that was interesting too. That like, hey, big takeaways: you can use spent hops as bittering additions, and it's not going to change any of the fermentation metrics of your beer. Now, this is where we get into one of those sort of caveat questions. And Dean brought this up in the episode that we talked about. There were sensory differences between the beer with the trained panel, but not with the consumers. And he mentioned the beers had actually measurably different iso-alpha acids concentration. So there was about 8 milligrams of difference. That's 8 IBUs of difference. And that's kind of on that line. Most cited research says somewhere between 5 to 10 IBUs is where people can taste the difference. They can't taste the difference between 5 and 10 IBUs. So like somewhere around 5 IBUs. 8 IBUs, can tasters taste a difference? Apparently the trained panel could, but the consumer panel couldn't. So I wanted to bring that up too. There were sensory differences in the beer, but with a slight asterisk of, hey, these beers actually did have measurable bitterness difference, even though they were tried to be brewed to the same specifications.
Well, but at that point, isn't that just a design flaw that
Sure.
if they just boosted it by 10% or whatever, that they would have been able to achieve the same thing. It's not like a function of the variable at its purest state. It's just a function of how much they used.
Exactly. I think that's exactly the case. And remember, when they were doing this study, they didn't know what kind of utilization they were going to get at this scale, right? They're testing to see if you get the same utilization. So they were doing, measure, figuring out how many alpha acids were actually in the spent hops, figuring out the alpha acids in the T90 pellets, using that to do a calculation, using a utilization metrics. So they had a guess that they would be pretty close. I think it's pretty awesome that they actually got it within 8 IBUs.
Yeah, that's incredible. So I want to come back to beta acids. Did they talk at all about? Did Dean talk about beta acids at all in the conversation or the study?
No, not in this conversation or the study. And I think there's a really important reason for that. I think it's because beta acids they are going to provide bitterness, but I don't think beta acids survive the boil. Oh man, as soon as I say that, I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I know that for sure. I felt really confident, right? That was like the wind up. Right. I was like, beta acids don't make it through the boil. But maybe it's just that the isomerized alpha acids are so much more bitter than beta acids. So if you're trying to recover beta acids, you're not recovering it for a huge amount of bitterness. It's going to be some bitterness, but it's not going to be like life-altering or changing bitterness.
Well, and why I mention it, and I'm working off the best of my memory here, but I recall hearing something about there's a reason that the hops that are used in commercial applications or homebrewing, tend to have alpha acid to beta acid ratio over 1.1, right? You don't tend to see hops that are used in beer where the beta acid content exceeds the alpha acid content. Something about it's not pleasurable. It doesn't make a good tasting beer. So and maybe it's like a harsher bitterness or something. And I want to say maybe Peacock has done some research looking at this stuff. And there's part of this is the conversation when it comes to aged hops and lambic production is like the beta acids. Maybe if I'm remembering correctly, they survive at a greater extent than the alpha acids do with long-term aging. And so it makes me wonder, what does the beta acid ratio look like in a spent hop? Because if we're blowing off 60% of the alpha, but a lot of the beta, survives, could that lead to a harsher bitterness or something? Could that help explain why the beer with spent hops was rated as more bitter? Or is it simply just a function of that 8 additional IBU?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So while you were talking about that, I just did like sort of a control find through Dean's thesis that he wrote at Oregon State. By the way, the thesis is available for people to review and read through. So if you're interested in the information on this, you can go and find that. He does cite to an article by DeGrande Hoffman, and it says the effects of beta acids from hops on a Varroa destructor. I don't know what that exactly means, but maybe that would have an explanation of like beta acids. And maybe we should get somebody on the show to talk about beta acids. Sounds like something that's interesting, right? Like the underappreciated. I mean, I had Martin Beendle on a while back to talk about polyphenols in hops, and I think that was a really cool episode. But I don't know. I do know that beta acids are they're obviously not as bitter as alpha acids, right? And they oxidize and can become bitter, but they're not going to add a huge punch of bitterness. They are just going to, maybe like you said, slightly change the character of the bitterness to make it more harsh. But so that's interesting. And so that's one of those things where you want to think about, right? Are we adding a bunch of beta acids, right? If we've taken alpha acids away and those beta acids are still there, are we adding a bunch of beta acids that's going to change the character of the bitterness? Yeah.
I got another good one. What about cohumulone? If Chinook is a high cohumulone hop and arguably makes a harsher bitterness, when used as a bittering addition, does the dry hopping process extract some of the cohumulone, thus making the spent hop formerly high cohumulone, now a low cohumulone variety that we could bitter with?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, right? So cohumulone is an alpha acid. So it would either theoretically fall under this umbrella, but that's a great example. The hop variety is going to have different concentrations of each of these, right? And there's cohumulone, inhumulone, and adhumulone, they're going to have different concentrations of these, so each hop might vary differently. So if I remember correctly, Dean used a mixture of hops in this because he was just getting hops from a commercial brewery, and I think they were something like here it is: Citra, Amarillo, Centennial, Mosaic, and Columbus. And so it was a mixture of 5 different hops. No Chinook in there. So yeah, maybe Chinook would be different. But how would a different hop variety work in this, right? I think that's a really cool and interesting conversation, and one that I think would be really fun to study. It's like, yeah, would Chinook be different? Because it's going to have different percentages of these cohumulones and lupulones. Humulone is alpha acid, lupulone is beta acid.
Well, the other thing that this is making me think about is vegetal matter.
Yeah.
The great Ashley Carter, the beer stock brewer in Denver, Colorado, seriously, some of the best lagers you're ever going to have in your life. She's a big believer in the German tradition of using low alpha hops in German lager brewing. The argument being that is just part of this ultimate, as you guys like to say, gestalt of the lager. Yeah. Is you need to use the lower alpha hops to achieve that. And obviously the noble varieties are relevant to the flavor profile, but there's this movement in American craft brewing. Well, let's be efficient here. Let's just use Magnum for bittering, or Warrior or something like that, and then we can start layering in the Sots and the Tettnanger towards the end when we can taste it. And her and others argue that that's a really important part of it. My guess is that the vegetal matter is part of it, right? If you're using 20, 30 IBUs of a 4% alpha acid hop, you have to use a lot more than a 15% alpha acid hop. And so maybe the amount of vegetal matter in the boil is part of that classic lager flavor from Europe. And so it makes me wonder, what is the implication here for spent hops? Like, maybe the American Noble product, which is, I think, the leftovers from the cryo process, maybe this is kind of like making American Noble at home, where you could have a lower alpha acid end result and be able to get that like high level of vegetal matter in the kettle that may or may not be kind of one of the secrets to lager success.
Yeah, I mean that's a great idea, right? And I would say like vegetal matter. When you say vegetal matter, I'm hearing and internalizing other stuff, right? Like whatever else is in the hops, right? I think you make a really good point there, right? I think Americans especially do this a lot, where we laser focus in on alpha acids, right? And you think like, okay, I'm going to add this much alpha acids, and if I do that, I'm going to get this much iso alpha acids, and then I'll have this bitter of a product. And that was also research that was done by Tom Shellhammer here too. And I think we mentioned it with Dean, with Christina Hahn. That was one of Tom's former graduate students. She looked at all these other compounds that add bitterness characteristics or other character to the beer, right? There's polyphenols, there's beta acids, there's oxidized products, and all of these change the character of the beer. So yeah, it does make me wonder, right? What happens if we're adding all this extra vegetal matter or quote other stuff into the beer? What are we doing? What are we changing? And I think that's a really cool, interesting one. I don't think that we have the information to answer that, at least not yet, based on Dean's research. I think it's just we're gonna have to brew with it and see, have other people do this and see.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the stuff is going to be style specific. I've heard brewers argue that it goes both ways. Like there are certain styles you don't want a ton of vegetal matter in the kettle because it just doesn't jive with the flavor profile we're trying to achieve for a given style. And so I think that kind of using this as a tool in your toolbox when appropriate. You don't use a hammer when you need to turn a bolt or something. Yeah. So thinking about when does this make sense to use?
Yeah. When does it make sense to use? And one of the questions I asked Dean was like, what about the beer that the spent hops are coming from, right? I mean, if you're using a beer with a high ABV, like 9% or something, is that additional ethanol extracting out a whole bunch of other stuff that's getting left in the beer? If you were dry hopping like a light lager or something, that doesn't have as high, or a pale ale, that maybe let's do that one, right? Like a pale ale that's like 5% or something, that's not high alcohol. is that just are more things getting left in the hops? They're not actually being extracted out into the beer. So how does the style of the beer that you dry hopped into change things?
Yeah, like in terms of impacting the amount of alpha left over.
Yeah.
Additionally, it makes me wonder, what if like you had a dry hop load from a Cascadian dark ale that you then used to bitter a Pilsner? Would the roasted malt character taint the subsequent Pilsner?
Yeah. And well, this is a great question too, because I don't want to forget about talking to this, is like, how do you make sure, this is a challenge, right? How do you make sure that the other stuff doesn't come along with the hops, right? Like you said, you've got a Cascadian dark ale with a whole bunch of roasted malts, and you want to pitch those hops into a Pilsner for bitterness, but you don't want to turn it, red or whatever color. It's not going to be a huge amount of color that's going to come over, but you don't want to mess that up, right? So how do you make sure that what you're pitching is actually spent hops, and not other things that are going to impact things like color or all that? So here's a question for you. If you were doing this at a homebrew scale, how would you do it?
Yeah, I think that the little dry hop canisters is a great way, or a bag, I think, because then it's already collected in a vessel. And I guess if it was in a bag, you could easily squeeze that as well.
Yep.
And I would probably be inclined to, like, the day that I racked off of dry hops or whatever to the serving keg or whatever would be the day that coincide with a brew day. So I can just immediately use the hops that day without having to store them. And because I would be worried that they're going to eventually mold or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that, just using a canister or a bag, squeezing it out, and then just doing a simple math, like let's say the alpha acids going in were 10 and they retain 60% of the bitterness. So now we call them 6 in the calculator, and then squeeze them out and just assume that the volume or the weight is the weight, and that 1 gram of this squeezed, pellet slurry thing equals 1 unit of dry, and throw it in at 6 minutes in the boil.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like one gram. Like, I love that example, right? Let's say it started at 10 IBUs. So it's 60% now. It's 10% alpha acids, and it's now 6% alpha acids. So you just change the calculator, right? You just change it from 10 to 6%, and you assume that the 1 gram is the same and pitch it in. That's exactly how I would do it. And you took the words right out of my mouth on the canister, right? I think that's the only way you can do it really as a home brewer, unless you've got, one of the like SS Brewtech or one of the yeast dump, fermenters, because then you might be able to, dump out, a good amount of the yeast and actually collect your hops off of the bottom, that way. But otherwise, how are you going to get the hops out of the fermenter? I think this is a big challenge for commercial brewers, because commercial brewers are especially going to have, it's just going to be a huge volume of hop, of spent material, and it's all going to have sucked up beer. And like you said, you're going to have to dry it out or press it or find some way to transfer it then over to the boil kettle. There's a lot of challenges that go to this. That doesn't mean, I think there's a lot of room for optimization here too. I mean, I think, there's a lot of room for people to figure out a way to make this work.
Well, I think the point here is sustainability, right? And so from a homebrew perspective, I wonder if dumping the cone from the bottom is actually a losing equation when it comes to sustainability. Because as I understand it, when you're dumping the bottom of a cone, at least when there's beer on top of it, is you get a lot of beer with it. Yeah. So you're gonna have to waste beer to collect these spent hops. So maybe the strategy would be there is rack as much as you can out of your unitank or whatever, and then but leaving a little bit behind to try to blast out the last little bit of the hop cone at the bottom, so that you're not wasting a bunch of beer, because you're not going to drink or reuse that beer once it's been oxidized in your collection vessel. But you need something in there to push the sludge out of the bottom, tri-clamp or whatever.
Yeah.
So maybe that is the strategy there. I think the other thing to think about, if using a unitank type system at the homebrew scale, is this would be a really good justification for cold crashing prior to dry hop, so you can get as much yeast particulate out of solution prior to adding the dry hop charge, so that your collected slurry is at that point mostly hops. So I think that this really exposes the value of those hop tubes, is effectively that's only going to have hops in there. You're not going to be getting yeast, et cetera, like you would with a unitank, dumping the cone situation.
Well, and commercial brewers, I hope you were listening to that too, because that sounds exactly like how you do it in a commercial brewing system too, right? The unitanks are set up to mimic what commercial systems look like. So I think that's exactly how you do it, right? Cold crash, get as much of that yeast particulate to settle out, try to dump that out before you add your hops in there, add your hops, rack off your beer, and then, use pressure in the tank to blow out the cone or a little bit of beer that's still in there. Then you're still going to have to separate it and stuff. But there's also a piece of me that sort of goes, why can't we just put the whole slurry over into the kettle and see what happens, right? I mean, Dean did this nice, like where he was pressing out, the liquid, and he had like a nice dry hop slurry that was frozen. And so it was like, nice and usable in that way and great for the experiment. But that's one of those things I was thinking about is like, why can't you just, who knows? Maybe it tastes gross, but maybe you can just transfer it.
I think that it's okay to get a little bit of yeast over there because that's effectively yeast nutrient, right?
Yeah.
Dead
Exactly.
yeast cells.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I've heard of that as like if you run out of yeast nutrient, in a pinch, just if you have like some old yeast laying around, toss it in 5 minutes towards the end of the boil, and then there's your yeast nutrient.
Yeah.
But I think that if you had a ton, like you pitched in at the homebrew scale an entire 5-gallon batches yeast cake at the 60-minute edition, I would be worried about that. And I had mentioned on a previous episode the BSG yeast nutrient recommends using a lot more than like the Y yeast brand yeast nutrient does. And I was like, I just followed the directions, and it was so many grams. It was crazy. Like Y yeast, I think, is like 2.5 grams per 5-gallon batch. This was something like 10, 20 or something grams were necessary given the instructions on the package. And I just followed the instructions, and then I happened to take a pH reading, and the pH was through the roof. It had increased the pH way above the range that you would expect following a mash pH of like 5.4.
Yeah.
And so I think that there would be pH concerns if you were to add a ton of yeast to the boil.
Yeah, that's a great comment, right? That's really going to change your pH. That's a really great comment. And I also wanted to ask you too about your 20-20-20 method. Could spent hops be incorporated into your 20-20-20 method?
Yeah, so I guess to recap what that was for IPA brewing, I have this 20-20 rule where I get 20 IBUs from 60 minutes, 20 IBUs from about 20 minutes, you give or take, 5 minutes there, and 20 IBUs from flame out. And I am mindful of low cohumulone hops for the first 60-minute addition to get 20 IBUs. And so in a world where this is reducing cohumulone, this could be a good thing. I am typically using, though, high alpha acid hops for my IPA 20-20-20 method. I want something to be fairly neutral. I'm not trying to get a whole bunch of, spicy Tettnang or Satz character in an American IPA. So I think that as long as the hop that you're using from the former dry hop is in a hop that would be normally appropriate for IPA, like Simcoe, I think this would totally work. And obviously, Cade, this begs for a Brewlosophy experiment.
It would be fantastic if we could find a way to do this. I was thinking like this would be really cool to see, right? You take one of those hop canisters and reuse it and see if you can get the same, brew the same beer. Potentially too, maybe we could send it in someplace and get the alpha acids actually measured.
Exactly.
So we could, so we could think about that. But it's something to think about. Certainly a cool Brewlosophy experiment. Well, all right. So we've applied the science. We've talked about like how we would do it if we were doing it at our brewery, what implications there might be. What are some challenges, the science itself. So, kind of like I would normally ask, right? Like I would normally ask like, what's the one thing that you want brewers to take away from this episode? But I don't want to ask that because this is basically like a whole summary episode. So I guess maybe a different way to say it is like, what do you think about reusing spent hops, right? Especially like reusing spent hops in the boil.
I think it's a pretty cool idea. I'm a sustainability nerd. It's really important for us to continue to make things as sustainable as possible. And if we can make beer that tastes just as good, if not better, using this method. And at the homebrew level with like the hop tube, it's easy enough to do. Why not? So I'm going to push for it for the crew. I think that we got to give this one a try.
Yeah, for sure. I agree, right? I think this is such a cool method, right? We've shown that there is stuff in there in those hops. If we can streamline and figure out if we can engineer, right, the process to recover those spent hops in a way that makes sense, there's a lot of opportunity there. I mean, think about it. I don't know. Also, there's a question, we didn't talk about this much, but what about like cereal repitching of dry hops, or if you needed to do that? I'm not sure that would necessarily be the best idea, or even how you would do that, right? But
eventually it's just gray matter.
Yeah, eventually it's just, because then you got to get it out of the boil and deal with all that stuff and trube and everything. And like, no. Maybe that's not a good idea. But hey, if you can reuse and reduce that cost of bittering a little bit, maybe it's something to explore. Again, really cool. And I think a lot of people, if you've got interest in this, check it out in your brewery and let us know. I mean, Jordan and I would love to hear from you. So anything else you wanted to add to the episode, Jordan?
Yeah, and if you're doing this, please send us beers. We'd love to try them.
Yeah, exactly. I love to try the beer. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for Wait, I don't have to do that anymore. You're becoming a regular co-host. I don't have to say thank you for joining me. You're going to be here every 2 weeks from now on. So awesome. So, Jordan, I'm looking forward to having you back and doing this as a more regular series. How about we say it like that?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Lots of cool things in the future to nerd out about.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Jordan and I will be back in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. So until then, be sure to check out the Brewlosophy podcast, the Hop Chronicles, Short and Shoddy, Brew It Yourself, and the brand new Brewlosophy show on YouTube. You can always check all these things out over at brewlosophy.com, but be sure to check out all of our other fun content as well. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.